Chapter 10. The hands of all the 4,000 electric clocks in all the Bloomsbury Century 4,000 rooms marked 27 minutes past 2. This hive of industry, as the director was fond of calling it, was in the full buzz of work. Everyone was busy, everything in ordered motion. Under the microscopes, their long tails furiously lashing, spermatozoa were burrowing headfirst into eggs, and, fertilized, the eggs were expanding, dividing, Oriv Bonkonovskified, budding and breaking up into whole populations of separate embryos. From the social predestination room, the escalators went rumbling down into the basement, and there, in the crimson darkness, stewing warm on their cushion of peritoneum engorged with blood surrogate and hormones, the fetuses grew and grew, or, poisoned, languished into a stunned epsilonhood. With a faint hum and rattle, the moving cracks crawled imperceptibly through the weeks, and the recapitulated aeons to where, in the decanting room, the newly unbottled babes uttered their first yell of horror and amazement. The dynamos purred in the sub-basement. The lifts rushed up and down. On all the 11 floors of nurseries, it was feeding time. From 1,800 bottles, 1,800 carefully labeled infants were simultaneously suctioning down their pint of pasteurized external secretion. Above them, in 10 successive layers of dormitory, the little boys and girls who were still young enough to need an afternoon sleep were as busy as everyone else, though they did not know it, listening unconsciously to hypopaidic lessons in hygiene and sociability, in class consciousness, and the toddler's love life. Above these again were the playrooms where, the weather having turned to rain, 900 older children were amusing themselves with bricks and clay modeling, Hunt the Zipper, and erotic play. Buzz, buzz, the hive was humming, busily, joyfully. Blithed was the singing of the young girls over their test tubes. The predestinators whistled as they worked, and in the decanting room, what glorious jokes were cracked above the empty bottles. But the director's face as he entered the fertilizing room with Henry Foster was grave, wooden with severity. A public example, he was saying. In this room, because it contains more high-case workers than any other in the century, I have told them to meet me here at 2:30. He does his work very well, put in Henry, with hypocritical generosity. I know, but that's the more reason for severity. His intellectual eminence carries with it corresponding moral responsibilities. The greater a man's talents, the greater his power to lead astray. It is better that one should suffer than that many should be corrupted. Consider the matter dispassionately, Mr. Foster, and you will see that no offense is so heinous as unorthodoxy of behavior. Murder kills only the individual, and, after all, what is an individual? Within a sweeping gesture, he indicated the rows of microscopes, the test tubes, the incubators. We can make a new one with the greatest ease, as many as we like. Unorthodoxy threatens more than the life of a mere individual. It strikes at society itself. Yes, at society itself, he repeated. Ah, but here he comes. Bernard had entered the room and was now advancing between the rows of fertilizers towards them. A veneer of jaunty self-coincidence thinly concealed his nervousness. The voice in which he said, "Good morning, Director," was absurdly too loud. That in which, correcting his mistake, he said, "You asked me to come and speak to you here," ridiculously soft. A squeak. Yes, Mr. Mark, said the director portentously. I did ask you to come here. You returned from your holiday last night, I understand. Yes, Bernard answered. Yes, repeated the director, lingering a serpent on the s, then suddenly raising his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, he trumpeted. Ladies and gentlemen. The singing of the girls over their test tubes, the preoccupied whistling of the microscopists suddenly ceased. There was a profound silence. Everyone looked around. Ladies and gentlemen, the director repeated once more. Excuse me for thus interrupting your labors. A painful duty constrains me. The security and stability of society are in danger. Yes, in danger. Ladies and gentlemen. This man, he pointed accusingly at Bernard, this man who stands before me here, this Alpha Plus to whom so much has been given and from whom, in consequence, so much must be expected, this colleague of yours, or should I anticipate and say this ex-colleague, has grossly betrayed the trust imposed in him by his heretical views on sport and soma, by the scandalous unorthodoxy of his sex life, but his refusal to obey the teachings of our Ford and behave out of office hours, even as a little infant. Here the director made a sign of the T. He has proven himself an enemy of society, a subverter, ladies and gentlemen, of all order and stability, a conspirator against civilization itself. For this reason, I propose to dismiss him with ignominy from the post he has held in this century. I propose forthwith to apply for his transfers to a sub-century of the lowest order, and in his punishment may serve the best interest of society, as far as possible removed from any important century of population. In Iceland, he will have small opportunity to lead others astray by his unfortunate example. The director paused. Then, folding his arms, he turned impressively to Bernard. For this reason, I propose to dismiss him with ignominy from the post he has held in this century. I propose forthwith to apply for his transference to a sub-century of the lowest order, and his punishment may serve the best interest of society, as far as possible removed from any important century of population. The Iceland he will have small opportunity to lead others astray by his unfortunate example. The director paused. Then, folding his arms, he turned impressively to Bernard. Marx, he said, can you show any reason why I should not execute the judgment passed upon you? Yes, I can, Bernard answered in a very loud voice, somewhat taken aback, but still majestically. Then show it, said the director. Certainly, but it's in the passage. One moment. Bernard hurried to the door and threw it open. Come in, he commanded, and the reason came in and showed itself. There was a gasp, a murmur of astonishment and horror. A young girl screamed. Standing on a chair to get a better view, someone upset 2 test tubes full of spermatozoa. Bloated, sagging, and among these firm youthful bodies, those undistorted faces, a strange and terrifying monster of middle-agedness. Linda advanced into the room, coquettishly smiling her broken and discolored smile, and rolling as she walked, with what was meant to be voluptuous undulation her enormous hunches. Bernard walked beside her. "There it is," he said, pointing at the director. "Did you think I didn't recognize him?" Linda asked indignantly. Then, turning to the director, "Of course I knew you, Tomakin. I should have known you anywhere, among 1,000. But perhaps you've forgotten me. Don't you remember? Don't you remember, Tomakin? You're Linda." She stood looking at him, her head on one side, still smiling, but with a smile that became progressively, in face of the director's expression of petrified disgust, less and less self-confident, that wavered and finally went out. "Don't you remember, Tomakin?" she repeated in a voice that trembled. Her eyes were anxious, agonized. The blotched and sagging face twisted grotesquely into the grimace of extreme grief. "Tomakin!" She held out her arms. Someone began to titter. "What's the meaning," began the director, "of this monstrous—" "Tomakin!" She ran forward, her blanket trailing behind her, threw her arms around his neck, hid her face on his chest. A howl of laughter went up irrepressibly. "This monstrous practical joke," the director shouted. Red in the face, he tried to disengage himself from her embrace. Desperately, she clung. "But I'm Linda! I'm Linda!" The laughter drowned her voice. "You made me have a baby!" She screamed above the uproar. There was a sudden and appalling hush. Eyes floated uncomfortably, not knowing where to look. The director went suddenly pale, stopped struggling, and stood, his hands on her wrists, staring down at her, horrified. Yes, a baby, and I was its mother." She flung the obscenity like a challenge into the outraged silence. Then, suddenly breaking away from him, ashamed, covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "It wasn't my fault, Tomakin, because I always did my drill. Didn't I? Didn't I? Always. I don't know how. If you knew how awful, Tomakin, but he was a comfort to me, all the same." Turning towards the door, "John!" she called. "John!" He came in at once, paused for a moment just inside the door, looked around, then soft on his moccasined feet, strode quickly across the room, fell to his knees in front of the director, and said in a clear voice, "My father!" The word for father was not so much obscene as with this connotation of something at one remove from the loathsomeness and moral obliquity of childbearing, merely gross, a scatological rather than a pornographic impropriety. The comically smutty word relieved what had become a quite intolerable session. Laughter broke out, enormous, almost hysterical, peal after peal, as though it would never stop. My father, and it was the director. My father. Oh, Ford, that was really too good. The whooping and the roaring renewed themselves. Faces seemed on the point of disintegration. Tears were streaming. 6 more test tubes of spermatozoa were upset. My father. Pale, wild-eyed, the director glared about him in an agony of bewildered humiliation. My father. The laughter, which had shown signs of dying away, broke out again more loudly than ever. He put his hands over his ears and rushed out of the room.